You know that moment when your entire world shifts, and you realize the two people you trusted most have been laughing behind your back for months? Yeah, I had that moment. Except I didn't cry, I didn't yell, and I definitely didn't let them know I knew. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and spent the next 6 months systematically dismantling everything they thought they'd built together. By the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. This is the story of how my wife and business partner tried to steal my company and my life, and how I made sure they ended up with absolutely nothing. My name is Marcus, and 12 years ago, I married the woman I thought was my soulmate. Her name was Jennifer, though everyone called her Jen. We met in college, one of those classic stories where I was the nerdy computer science guy and she was the business major with big dreams and bigger ambitions. She used to tell me that together we'd build something incredible. That we were a team. That she'd handle the business side while I created the magic. For a long time, I believed her. After graduation, I worked as a software engineer for various tech companies, grinding away, learning everything I could. Jen worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm and she was good at it, I'll give her that. She knew how to sell a vision, how to make people believe in something. That's what made what came later so much more painful, because she sold me a vision of our future, and I bought every single word. About 7 years into our marriage, I had developed something special. I'd been working on it in my spare time for almost 2 years, a proprietary software platform that could revolutionize inventory management for medium-sized retail businesses. I know that sounds boring, but trust me, in the right hands this thing was a gold mine. The existing solutions on the market were either too expensive for mid-sized companies or too basic to actually solve their problems. Mine hit the sweet spot and I knew it. I showed it to Jen first, of course. I was so excited, staying up until 3 in the morning to finish the demo, and then waking her up to show her. She was amazing that night. She got it immediately, saw the potential, started talking about market positioning and customer acquisition strategies. That's when she said we should start our own company. That this was our moment. Our chance to build that dream together. I was hesitant at first. Starting a company is risky and we had a comfortable life. But Jen was persuasive. She always was. She painted this picture of financial freedom, of building something that was ours, of finally being our own bosses. And honestly, the idea of working side by side with my wife, building something together, that appealed to me more than anything. So I agreed. There was one problem though. Neither of us knew much about actually running a company from a legal and operational standpoint. We needed a third partner, someone who understood the business formation side, the legal structures, someone who could help us navigate the early stages. That's when Jen suggested her colleague from her marketing firm, a guy named Derek Chin. Derek was one of those guys who seemed to have it all together. Mid-30s, always dressed sharp, had an MBA from a good school, worked in business development and corporate strategy. He was charismatic, confident, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and immediately command attention. Jen had worked with him on a few campaigns and said he was brilliant, that he'd be perfect to help us structure the company properly. We met him for coffee and I have to admit I was impressed. He asked all the right questions about the software, understood the market opportunity, and laid out a clear path for how we could structure the business to attract early investment while maintaining control. He offered to come on as a third partner, handling the operational and strategic side while Jen managed marketing and sales, and I focused on product development. He'd take a smaller equity stake, 20% to our 40% each, since we were bringing the core product. It seemed fair. We shook hands that day. I remember feeling like this was really happening, like we were actually doing this. Derek said he'd handle all the incorporation paperwork, get us properly structured as an LLC, and make sure we were set up for success. I was so focused on refining the software that I was happy to let him handle that side of things. The first year was incredible. We called the company Streamline Ops, and Derek really delivered on the operational front. He set up our office space, hired our first 2 employees, and established relationships with potential clients. Jen was out there pitching like crazy, and she was landing meetings with companies I didn't think would even take our calls. I was in heaven, just coding away, improving the platform, adding features, making it better every single day. By the end of year 1, we had 15 clients and were actually profitable. Not wildly profitable, but we were in the black, which for a startup is pretty damn good. Derek kept talking about scaling, about how we needed to think bigger, bring in more investment. He'd started having these regular meetings with Jen about growth strategy, and I was usually too buried in development work to join. I trusted them to handle that side of things. Year 2 is when things really took off. We landed a major client, a regional retail chain with over 200 locations. It was a 6-figure contract, our biggest by far, and suddenly we were a real company. We hired 10 more people. Derek brought in a small seed investment round from some local angel investors, which gave us runway to expand even faster. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But that's also when I started noticing little things. Small things at first. Jen started working later hours, which made sense given how much we were growing, but she also became more distant at home. Less interested in talking about the business with me, more secretive about her phone. When I'd ask her about her day, she'd give vague answers and change the subject. I told myself I was being paranoid. We were under a lot of stress. Building a company is hard on any marriage, and we were both exhausted all the time. Plus, business was booming, so whatever we were doing was working, right? Derek started acting differently too. He became more assertive in company decisions, sometimes overriding things I wanted to do with the product. A few times he and Jen would have these private conversations in his office, and when I'd walk in, they'd quickly change the subject or stop talking altogether. Once I made a joke about them having a secret plan, and the look they exchanged made my stomach turn, but I pushed the feeling down. The real turning point came during our 3rd year in business. We were up to 30 employees, had over 100 clients, and were doing multiple millions in annual revenue. Derek had been pushing hard for us to bring in a Series A investment round, real venture capital money. He said we could scale nationally, maybe even internationally, but we needed serious capital to do it right. I wasn't sure. We were growing fine organically, and I didn't love the idea of diluting our ownership or having outside investors breathing down our necks. But Derek was insistent, and Jen backed him up. They kept saying I was thinking too small, that this was our chance to really make it big. Eventually I gave in. I usually did when it was the two of them against me. Derek led the fundraising process. He was in his element, pitching to VCs, negotiating term sheets, handling all the legal documentation. I sat in on some of the meetings, but honestly, a lot of that stuff went over my head. I was the tech guy, not the finance guy. I focused on making sure the product could handle the scale they were promising investors. We closed a Series A round of $12 million. $12 million. I couldn't believe it. We were a real startup now, with real backing, and Derek said this was just the beginning. The round was led by a firm called Apex Ventures, and they were taking a 30% stake in the company. Derek had structured the deal so that the 3 of us founders would maintain control with our combined 70%. That's when I decided to really look at our corporate structure for the first time in almost 3 years. I'd been so focused on building the product that I'd let Derek handle all the legal and operational documentation. But with this much money involved, and with outside investors now in the picture, I wanted to understand exactly where everything stood. I requested copies of all our corporate documents from Derek. The operating agreement, the cap table, all of it. He seemed hesitant, said it was all pretty standard stuff and I didn't need to worry about it, but I insisted. Something in my gut told me I needed to see these documents with my own eyes. When I finally got them, I read through everything carefully. And that's when I found it. A clause in the operating agreement, buried in Section 14, subsection C. It was dense legal language, but essentially it said that in the event of certain trigger events, including divorce of any founding member or the voluntary departure of any founding member, their shares could be subject to mandatory buyout at a price determined by a valuation formula outlined in an appendix. I looked at the valuation formula. It was based on a multiple of EBITDA, but the multiple was absurdly low. Like criminally low. If this clause was triggered, someone could be forced to sell their 40% stake for maybe a tenth of what it was actually worth, especially now with the Series A valuation. My heart started racing. I read it again, then again. This wasn't standard. This was designed to screw someone over. And Derek had drafted this. He'd handled all the incorporation paperwork, which meant this had been in our operating agreement since day one. I immediately scheduled a meeting with a corporate attorney, someone completely separate from our company. I brought all the documents and asked him to review them. He looked everything over and confirmed my worst fear. The operating agreement was incredibly lopsided. Not only did it have that mandatory buyout clause, but it also gave the managing member, which was designated as Derek, extraordinary power to make unilateral decisions about major company matters. Basically, Derek had structured things so that he had control that far exceeded his 20% stake. The attorney asked me if I'd had my own lawyer review this before signing. I admitted I hadn't. He shook his head and said this was one of the most founder-unfriendly operating agreements he'd ever seen. He asked me point blank if I'd been planning to divorce or leave the company when I signed this, because this agreement was basically designed to strip someone of their equity in exactly those scenarios. That's when everything clicked into place. The late nights. The private conversations. The way Derek and Jen always seemed to be aligned against me lately. The fact that Jen had suggested bringing Derek in. The fact that Derek had insisted on handling all the legal paperwork himself. I felt sick. But I didn't panic. Not yet. I needed proof before I did anything. I went home that night and Jen was already asleep or pretending to be. I looked at her lying there and realized I didn't even know this person anymore. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd built a company with, might be planning to destroy me. The next day I did something I'm not proud of, but I had to know. I installed monitoring software on the company's Slack account. As a co-founder and the CTO, I had administrative access to do this, and I justified it to myself as security monitoring. I also started paying more attention to Jen's behavior, when she was on her phone, who she was texting. It took less than a week to find what I was looking for. Derek and Jen had a private Slack channel, just the two of them. And they'd been sloppy. The messages went back almost 18 months. 18 months. At first it was just flirty. Compliments about appearances, inside jokes, innuendo. Then it got more explicit. They were sleeping together. Meeting at hotels during client meetings. The messages were graphic enough that I had to stop reading a few times. But worse than the affair was what else I found. They were planning something. There were messages about how they needed to time things right and make sure everything is in place before we make a move. There were discussions about the company valuation, about the Series A round, about how much the company would be worth once we hit certain revenue milestones. And then I found the message that confirmed everything. It was from Jen to Derek, sent about 2 months before we closed the Series A round. Once we get the funding and hit our Q3 targets, the company will be valued at 50M plus. That's when we do it. I'll file for divorce, trigger the buyout clause. Marcus is so checked out of the business side he won't even see it coming. Between your managing member authority and my 40%, we'll have control. We buy him out for pennies on the dollar per the agreement, and we own a company worth tens of millions. Then it's just you and me, baby. Derek's response, you're brilliant. I knew partnering with you was the right move. He built a great product, but he's too small-minded to see what we can do with it. This is just business. And once the business is handled, we can finally be together properly. I sat there staring at my computer screen for I don't know how long. These two people, the wife I'd loved for 12 years and the business partner I'd trusted with my company, had been planning to steal everything from me. And they'd been sleeping together while doing it. Most people would have confronted them right then. Screamed, yelled, maybe thrown a punch. But I didn't. Because I realized something sitting there reading those messages. They'd made a mistake. A big one. They'd assumed I was too focused on the tech to pay attention to the business. They'd assumed I'd be blindsided. They'd assumed I was stupid. They were wrong. I copied everything. Every message, every document, every email. I backed it all up in multiple places they couldn't access. Then I closed my laptop and I smiled. Because I realized that while they'd been planning to screw me for 18 months, I now had time to plan something better. I went home that night and acted completely normal. Jen asked how my day was. I said it was fine, just working on some new features. She kissed me on the cheek, that same casual kiss she'd been giving me for months, and went back to scrolling on her phone, probably texting Derek. The next morning, I called the corporate attorney again and set up an emergency meeting. I brought him everything. He read through the Slack messages, looked at the operating agreement again, and actually whistled. He said I had a few options. I could confront them now, try to renegotiate the operating agreement, maybe threaten legal action for breach of fiduciary duty. But he warned me that would be messy, expensive, and uncertain. Derek's managing member authority gave him a lot of power, and even with proof of the affair and their planning, unwinding everything would take years and might not succeed. Or he said I could play a different game. He asked me a question I'll never forget. He said, "What does your company actually need to run?" I thought about it. Streamline Ops was built on software that I had created. The core platform, the proprietary algorithms, the unique features that made it special, all of that existed because of code I had written. Sure, we had other developers now, but they were working on my architecture, extending my systems. Then he asked me another question. He said, "Who owns the intellectual property?" I pulled up the IP assignment agreements. We'd all signed them when we incorporated, agreeing that any IP created for the company belonged to the company. But then I realized something. The core platform, the original software I'd built, I'd created that before we incorporated. I'd shown it to Jen, we'd decided to start a company around it, and then we'd incorporate it. But I'd built the actual software before Streamline Ops existed. The attorney saw me realize this and smiled. He said we needed to check if I'd ever explicitly assigned that pre-incorporation IP to the company. We went through every document. And we couldn't find one. There was no assignment agreement for the original software. Everything I'd built after incorporation, sure, that belonged to the company. But the foundation, the core platform that everything else was built on top of, that was still mine. The attorney said this was the leverage I needed. The company couldn't function without that original code base. Everything else was built on top of it. If I could prove ownership of that original IP and that it was never properly assigned, I could create a situation where the company would need to negotiate with me. But he warned me this had to be done carefully. If I just suddenly claimed ownership, they could argue it was an implied assignment, or that I'd been acting as if the company owned it all along. We needed a cleaner approach. That's when we came up with the plan. First, I would secretly start a new company. Just me, completely separate. I would begin developing a new version of the software platform, built from scratch but using the same fundamental concepts and approaches as the original. Since those concepts came from my pre-incorporation work, I had every right to reuse them. I'd make this new version even better, more streamlined, and most importantly, completely independent of the Streamline Ops codebase. Second, I would document everything about the original software's development. I went back through old files, found the original code repositories with timestamps showing I'd created them before we incorporated, gathered old emails and notes where I'd been developing the concepts. I built an airtight case that the foundational IP was mine and had never been properly assigned. Third, and this is the part that required patience, I would let them proceed with their plan. Let Jen file for divorce. Let them trigger the buyout clause. Let them think they were winning. And then, once they'd committed, once they'd bought me out and thought they had the company, I would pull the rug out from under them. The attorney said it would take about 6 months to do this properly. To set up the new company, develop the new platform to a functional state, and gather all the evidence I needed. He also said that during this time I couldn't let on that I knew anything. I had to act normal, keep working at Streamline Ops, keep going home to Jen every night like nothing was wrong. 6 months. I had to pretend for 6 months. I had to watch my wife kiss me goodbye while she left to sleep with Derek. I had to sit in business meetings with Derek while he pretended to be my friend and partner. I had to smile and nod and act oblivious while they plotted to destroy me. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I did it, because I knew what was waiting at the end. I worked on the new platform every night after Jen went to bed, and every weekend when she was supposedly visiting her parents or out with friends, which I now knew meant she was with Derek. I rebuilt everything from the ground up, making it better, faster, more efficient. I called it Streamline Pro. I also started documenting everything at Streamline Ops. Every decision Derek made, every line of code I wrote, every contribution I made to the business. I kept meticulous records of how the company would struggle without my daily involvement. Meanwhile, Jen and Derek got sloppier. They probably figured they were in the home stretch. The company hit the Q3 revenue targets they'd mentioned in their messages. Our valuation was now around $60 million based on the metrics our investors were using, which meant my 40% stake was worth about $24 million. According to the buyout clause, they'd be able to force me to sell it for maybe $2 or $3 million. They'd effectively be stealing over $20 million from me. In early November, almost exactly 6 months after I'd discovered their plan, Jen finally made her move. She sat me down one evening and said we needed to talk. She said she wasn't happy, that she'd been feeling disconnected, that she thought we should separate. She tried to make it sound mutual, like she cared about my feelings. I asked her if there was someone else. She hesitated, then said no, she just needed space. She was lying right to my face. I told her I was disappointed, but if that's what she needed, I understood. I didn't yell, didn't argue. I think my calmness threw her off. She probably expected me to beg her to stay, to fight for our marriage. Instead, I just said okay. The next day, I got served with divorce papers. And the day after that, Derek called a meeting with me. He said that given the divorce and given how distracted I'd seemed lately, maybe it would be best for the company if we discussed me stepping back. He pulled out the operating agreement and pointed to the buyout clause. He offered me $3 million for my 40% stake. $3 million for shares worth $24 million. He tried to spin it like he was being generous, like this would let me walk away clean and start fresh. He actually put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I know this is hard, man, but it's what's best for everyone." I looked him in the eye and said I needed a few days to think about it. He said sure, take a week, but we needed to move quickly to avoid disrupting the business. That week, I had my attorney send letters to both Jen and Derek and to the company. The letters explained that I was the original creator and owner of the foundational IP that Streamline Ops was built upon. That this IP had never been properly assigned to the company. That I was willing to license it to Streamline Ops, but we needed to discuss terms. The day Derek got that letter was the most satisfying day of my life. He called me immediately, furious, saying this was ridiculous, that I was being vindictive, that obviously everything I'd built belonged to the company. I told him to have his attorney review the documents. There was no assignment agreement for the pre-incorporation work. I knew the moment it sank in for him. There was this long silence on the phone. Then he said we needed to meet in person immediately. We met at the office. Derek was there, Jen was there, and they brought the company's attorney. My attorney was with me. The company's attorney reviewed my evidence and I could see his face fall. He pulled Derek and Jen aside and explained the situation to them. I watched Derek's face go red, watched Jen's eyes fill with panic. The company's attorney came back and asked what I wanted. I said it was simple. I wanted fair value for my shares. $24 million or I would revoke the company's implicit license to use my IP and they could watch the entire business collapse. Derek lost it. Started yelling about how I couldn't do this, how this was extortion, how he'd sue me into oblivion. My attorney calmly explained that not only could I do this, but I also had evidence of Derek's breach of fiduciary duty and fraud in how he'd structured the operating agreement. And I had evidence of his affair with Jen, which showed a clear conflict of interest and conspiracy to defraud me. Jen was crying now, saying I was being cruel, that we could work this out. I just looked at her and said, I deserve to be happy too, Jen. Don't worry, I'm sure you and Derek will figure something out. But I wasn't done. I told them I didn't actually want to stay in Streamline Ops anymore. They'd poisoned it for me. So here's what was going to happen. They were going to buy me out at fair value, $24 million. And I was going to take my foundational IP with me. Derek said that was insane, that without that IP the company couldn't function. I smiled and said that sounded like a them problem. But I was willing to offer a solution. I'd give them an 18-month license to use the IP while they rebuilt on a different foundation, or found another solution. 18 months. The same amount of time they'd been planning to screw me over. I thought that was poetic. The company's attorney tried to argue, tried to find a way out, but I had them cornered. Every path led to the same place. They either paid me fair value and got a temporary license, or I pulled the IP immediately and the company crashed. With millions in investor money and dozens of employees depending on the business, they couldn't let it crash. It took another month of negotiation, but eventually they had no choice. The company paid me $24 million for my stake. I signed over everything I'd built while at Streamline Ops, but I retained the rights to my original pre-incorporation work and granted them an 18-month license. I also made sure the divorce settlement was fair. Jen got nothing from the buyout since it was my equity, not marital property acquired during the marriage. She tried to fight it, but with evidence of her affair and the conspiracy to defraud me, her attorney advised her to take what she could get. The best part? I already had Streamline Pro ready to go. The day the buyout closed, I launched my new company. I reached out to several of Streamline Ops' best clients, the ones I had personal relationships with, and offered them a migration to a superior platform at a reduced rate. About 40% of them jumped ship within the first 3 months. Derek and Jen tried to rebuild Streamline Ops on a new foundation, but they couldn't do it in 18 months. Their developer team, which had been working with my architecture for years, struggled to create something new from scratch. Client satisfaction dropped. Employees started leaving. By the time their license to my IP expired, the company was worth a fraction of what it had been. Meanwhile, Streamline Pro took off. I brought on a proper business co-founder, someone I vetted extensively this time, and we grew fast. Within 2 years, we were bigger than Streamline Ops had ever been. And I own the majority of it. Last I heard, Streamline Ops finally sold to a competitor for about $8 million. Derek and Jen split that with their investors, walking away with maybe $1 million each after all the debt and obligations were settled. They'd gone from potentially owning a company worth $60 million to barely scraping out $1 million each. And me? I built an even better company, kept my integrity, and I'm worth far more now than I ever would have been staying with them. Jen reached out once about a year after everything settled. She said she was sorry, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she hoped I could forgive her someday. I never responded. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes. The crazy thing is, if they'd just been honest, if they just valued what I brought to the table and treated me fairly, we all could have been successful together. But greed and betrayal made them stupid. They thought I was too focused on the tech to see what they were doing. They thought they were smarter than me. Turns out, the guy who builds the foundation gets to decide if it stands or falls. And I chose to let their house of cards collapse while I built something better on solid ground. That's my story. Sometimes revenge isn't about being loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's about being patient, being smart, and making sure that when someone tries to bury you, you're actually planting seeds.